She was 22 years old, and in the careful paper-shuffling way that such things are arranged, she had just become a person with nowhere to go. We should tell you that right from the start, before anything else. Because this is a story about a young woman named Dinah Frew, and the story does not begin with triumph, or with any particular advantage. It begins with an envelope containing $94, and a man who could not quite meet her eyes when he handed it to her. Settle in, wherever you are tonight. We are glad to have you with us. Dinah Frew had grown up in the workshop, not in the house, not in the kitchen, not in any of the places a girl was supposed to grow, but in the low, sawdust-floored room behind her father's house in Ferris Landing, where Leonard Frew kept his planes and chisels and the good cherrywood boards he saved for commission pieces. Her earliest memory was the smell of that room, linseed oil and fresh-cut maple, and the faint smoke from the small iron stove her father lit each morning before the town was awake. Leonard Frew was a joiner, not a rough carpenter, not a log splitter, but a craftsman who built the things people touched every day: tables, cupboard doors, drawer slides that opened like a whisper and closed like a sigh. He worked slowly and without apology. He was a small man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of going quiet whenever he needed to think, which was often, and the town of Ferris Landing regarded him as a gentle eccentric and brought him work nonetheless. He taught Dinah the names of things before she could read: the mortise, the tenon, the grain that runs like a river through a plank of ash and must be followed, not fought. He had made her a marking gauge when she was 6, a small tool sized for a child's hand, with a fence of deep red cherry and a brass thumbscrew he had salvaged from a broken clock. On one smooth face he had scratched the letter D with the tip of his smallest gouge. It was the only personalized thing she owned. Leonard died of consumption in the winter she was 9. It happened quietly, the way poverty rearranges a life without announcing itself. And when the ground thawed enough to bury him, Dinah found herself in a wagon bound for the mill town of Cotter's Ridge, sent to live with her mother's brother, a man named Warren Colp. Warren Colp owned the mill. Not all of Cotter's Ridge, though it sometimes seemed that way. He owned the building where the timber came in, and the building where the cut boards went out, and most of the structures in between. He was a man of practical intelligence and no sentiment, and when Dinah arrived at his door with a canvas bag and her father's marking gauge tucked into her coat pocket, he looked at her the way a man looks at a timber lot, assessing the yield. He did not beat her. He did not starve her. He gave her a cot in the room above the cookhouse, 3 meals a day, and the understanding that she would earn her place. She ran errands for the mill office. She helped in the cookhouse kitchen. She darned and mended, and kept the ledger room tidy and swept the sawdust from the walkways each morning before the men arrived. Warren Colp was not a cruel man in any way that left marks. He was simply a man who had never learned to see a person where he saw a resource. For 8 years, she worked like this, growing up in the margins of someone else's life. The person who noticed her was an old mill hand named Calvin Spar. Calvin Spar was 60 years old and had spent 40 of those years in the bush, working timber operations across northern Ontario. He had a face like old bark and hands that moved with an unhurried competence she recognized from watching her father. He had seen, sometime in her 2nd year at the mill, that the girl who swept the walkways was watching the framers work. Not the way a child watches out of boredom, but the way a person watches when they are memorizing something. In the evenings, when the mill was quiet, he showed her things. How to read the twist in a board before you commit a plane to it. How to test a joint by feel before you ever apply glue. How to select a chisel by the weight of it in your palm by the way it wants to be held. He never made a ceremony of it. He handed her a tool, showed her the motion, watched her try it, corrected her grip with a nudge of his thumb, and went back to his own work. She learned more from Calvin Spar in 8 years than she would have learned in twice that time in any formal apprenticeship. She kept all of it in her hands and said nothing. It was not time yet. She was not sure for what, but she was not foolish enough to believe nothing was coming. What came on a Thursday morning in early September was Warren Colp calling her into his office. It was a room she entered rarely, a place of lumber tallies and mill contracts that smelled of coal oil and dried mud. He stood behind his desk when she arrived, his expression arranged into something between business and mild discomfort, and he did not ask her to sit. His son Gideon, he explained, was returning from his time in the East and would be taking over the operations of the mill. Gideon's wife would be managing the household and cookhouse staff. The arrangement had been restructured. Her room above the cookhouse was needed for the new foreman, who would be arriving in October. Warren Colp paused. He looked at the window. Her position, he said, had become redundant. He placed a plain envelope on the desk between them. Inside, he explained, was $94. 50 of it was her father's estate, a small insurance policy Leonard Frew had paid into for 3 years before the consumption took him, which Warren Colp had been holding in trust. The remaining 44 he described as a fair severance, calculated against the years of her labor at a rate she was in no position to contest. He did not apologize. There was nothing in his voice that suggested he considered this anything other than the closing of an account. Dinah stood perfectly still. She felt the marking gauge in her coat pocket, the smooth cherry wood warm against her fingers, and she thought of her father at his bench, going quiet when he needed to think. She thought of how he had never wasted a word on something that didn't matter. She took the envelope. "I understand," she said. She left the office, left the cookhouse, and walked out into the September morning with everything she owned in a canvas bag, $94, and a marking gauge that had belonged to a man who had once told her that wood remembers everything done to it. She did not look back at the mill. Harrow Falls was 2 days' walk south. It was the closest town with a land office and a mercantile, a place of mud-rutted streets and false-fronted buildings that leaned against each other like tired men. Dinah arrived in the early afternoon of the second day and went directly to the office of the land agent, a man named Mr. Purvis, whose name was stenciled on the door in faded gold paint. She asked, without sitting down and without explaining herself, what parcels were available in the surrounding townships and what they cost. Mr. Purvis looked at her with the mild, pleasant contempt of a man who considers himself about to say something amusing. He gestured at the survey map on the wall behind him, a large, spotted thing pinned crookedly to the plaster. Most of what was worth having, he told her, had been claimed years ago by the logging operations and the larger homesteaders. What remained was cutover bush, boggy ground, or lots too remote to service. He folded his hands on the desk. For what she might be carrying, he said, smiling at a point slightly above her left shoulder, she might manage a burial lot in the churchyard. Not much else. Then something shifted in his expression, a small thought enjoying itself. He told her about the Maddock claim. 10 acres of cutover birch and spruce on the south side of the old Birchfall Road, with a collapsed cabin and a rusted saw pit that hadn't been used in 15 years. It had sat on the county books since 1882. Nobody had filed on it because the timber was gone and the ground wasn't fit for crops. It was, he said, land that had used itself up. He told her the price. Filing fees included, it came to $93.50. He was still smiling when she said, "I'll take it." The smile stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to the filing cabinet. She walked out of the land office in Harrow Falls an hour later with 50 cents in her pocket and a deed to 10 acres of what most people in that town would have called nothing. She spent the 50 cents on a small bag of dried peas and a box of matches, and she began the walk north along the Birchfall Road. The road was not much used. It narrowed after the first mile, the gravel giving way to packed dirt tracks, and after another mile, it was nothing but a faint path through second-growth birch. The trees closed in on either side, white-barked and thin-leaved, and a whiskey jack called once from somewhere in the branches and then went quiet. The September light fell through the canopy in long late-afternoon angles that made everything look older than it was. She found the cabin as the sun dropped behind the tree line. It had collapsed on one side, the north wall giving way to the weight of years and the slow insistence of frost and thaw. What remained standing was the south and east walls and the fireplace, a deep, well-built fireplace of stacked granite, dark with old smoke, its chimney still rising intact above the ruin. She walked through the doorframe, which still stood, and looked at what she had. The fireplace was the best thing in the wreck. She could see that at once. Someone had built it carefully, fitting each stone without mortar and relying on the weight and angle of every piece to lock the others in place. The same principle as a good dovetail. Really, it told her something about the person who had built it. She slept that night, wrapped in her blanket at the base of the fireplace, which still held a little warmth from the sun-heated stone. In the morning, she began with the hearth. The firebox had years of leaf mold and debris packed into it, and she cleared it out with a stick and then with her bare hands, working her way back to the stone floor of the box. The floor was a single slab of flat granite, wide and heavy, set as level as a workbench. It was cleaner than it should have been, given everything around it. The kind of clean that comes from being covered, not from being washed. She crouched and looked at the edges of the slab. On the south side, the gap between the hearthstone and the surrounding rock was wider than it ought to be. Not by much, but she was a joiner's daughter, and she noticed gaps. She worked the blade of her marking gauge into the seam and pried carefully. The stone shifted. She repositioned, got both hands under the edge, and heaved. The hearthstone lifted. Beneath it, in a shallow hand-dug hollow, lined with birch bark to keep the moisture out, sat an oilskin bundle tied with braided twine, and beside it, wrapped separately in a square of canvas, something long and flat. Her hands were steadier than she expected when she reached in and lifted them both out. She unwrapped the long, flat bundle first. Inside, nestled in a roll of chamois leather, was a set of bench chisels. 6 of them, graduated in width from 1/4 inch to 1.5 inches, their handles turned from apple wood. Their blades ground to a hollow bevel. She recognized immediately as the mark of someone who understood their tools deeply. The steel was fine. She tested the edge of the narrowest one against her thumbnail and pulled back at the bite. These had been made for work, not display. They had been stored here by someone who valued them and meant for them to be found. She set them aside and opened the oilskin bundle. Inside was a flat tin box, sealed with a rubber gasket she had to work loose with her knife. And inside the tin, packed in folded oilcloth, was a dense stack of Dominion of Canada notes, older printing, crisp and dry. She counted slowly twice. $360. She sat back on her heels and breathed. The letter was folded beneath the money, written in a close, deliberate hand on paper, yellowed at the margins, but perfectly legible. My name is Elroy Bast. I am a furniture maker by trade. I came to this parcel in 1884 after the Harrow Timber Company finished cutting this land and moved on. I built the cabin in the saw pit, and I worked here for 9 years, making chairs and cupboard frames and bedsteads for the homesteads along the North Roads. It was a good life. In 1893, the company claimed I owed a road use fee they had never once mentioned before. I did not have the money to fight it. I had to leave. I am leaving this box because I have no heirs and no one to give it to. The money is what I saved over those 9 years. The chisels were my father's. I am going to my sister's house in Sudbury, and I am old enough to know I will not come back. If you are reading this, you found your way here. That already tells me something about you. Use the money to build something that will last. The clay along the South Creek bank makes good mortar. The birch that has grown back is good for turning stock. There is flat stone in the creek bed for a proper foundation, if you need one. There is one more thing. If you need help, or company, or anything the town will not give you, follow the old corduroy road east from the back corner of this property. Everyone in Harrow Falls will tell you it ends in Muskeg. It does not. After the Muskeg, there is a section of higher ground the old corduroys cross, and beyond that the road continues another 3 miles through the spruce. At the end of it is a place called Slate Creek. It is not on any county map. The people there chose to be off it. Tell them Elroy Bast sent you. They will understand what that means. I hope this land is good to you. I hope you build something the weather cannot reach. Elroy Bast, October 1893. Dinah read the letter twice. She sat in the ruined cabin with the September wind moving through the broken walls, and the chisels set laid out on the chamois beside her, and she read it a second time more slowly. A man she would never meet had left her the foundation of a life. He had placed his savings and his father's tools beneath a stone in the floor of a cabin he'd been driven from, had wrapped them in oilskins, sealed them in tin, written a letter with practical advice about clay and creekstone, and had waited, in the way that the dead wait, for whoever came next. She picked up one of the applewood chisel handles and felt the smoothness of it, the way it had been worn to fit a hand slightly larger than hers. She thought of her own father's tools, sold off after he died to cover the cost of his burial. She thought of the marking gauge in her pocket, the only piece of him she had carried this far. 2 men she had never known, both of them joiners, both of them gone. She set the marking gauge down on the chamois beside Elroy Bast's 6 chisels and looked at the 2 of them together for a long moment. Then she stood, wrapped the chisels back in their leather, tucked the money and the letter into the inside pocket of her coat, and started building a list in her head. She walked back to Harrow Falls the next morning and went nowhere near Mr. Purvis's office. She went directly to Cranmer and Sons Mercantile and bought what she needed with the deliberateness of a person who has thought it through. A crosscut saw, a claw hammer, a draw knife, 24 4-inch spikes, milled boards for a subfloor, rolls of tar paper, a small cast-iron stove with elbowed pipe, lamp oil, flour, salt pork, dried beans, and a 50-pound sack of oats. She paid in notes from Elroy Bast's tin box, and the woman at the counter who had barely glanced at her when she came in was now attentive and helpful in every way. Transport was the remaining problem. Her supplies formed a considerable pile on the loading dock, and the Maddock property was 7 miles north on a road that had declined to a footpath. The owner of Cranmer and Sons mentioned a man named Conrad Vale, a retired freighter who still kept a pair of mules and a flat deck wagon and would haul for a fair price. She found him in the livery stable, sharpening a hame bolt. A man in his late 60s with a gray beard, trimmed to an almost military neatness, and the particular stillness that comes from having done hard physical work for a very long time. He looked at her supplies. He looked at her. He consulted the road map on the stable wall without being asked, locating the Birchfall Road from memory. "That road's rough past the creek crossing," he said. "I know it," she said. "You're taking the Maddock claim?" "I own it now." He looked at her hands then. More than her face, she noticed, and she found she didn't mind. "I'll take you up Saturday morning," he said. "Weather holds." The weather held. Conrad Vale's mules picked their way up the Birchfall Road with the patience of experienced animals. And when they reached the property and Conrad Vale climbed down from the wagon and stood looking at what she had to work with, he was quiet for a moment, in the particular way of men who are deciding something. "Run your floor joists, east to west," he said, nodding at the standing walls. "Use that chimney stack as your anchor point. It's the solidest thing on the property." He helped her unload the heavy stove and the board lumber. Before he left, he lifted his hat, which was his version of a considerable gesture, and turned the mules back toward town. She worked for 3 weeks. She had never built a floor or framed a wall from scratch. But she had watched. She had Calvin Sparr's patient instructions in her hands and her father's sense of proportion in her eye, and she made her mistakes in the first 2 days and corrected them and stopped making them. She laid the subfloor first, fitting each board tight against the next, so no light showed through the seams. She framed the collapsed north wall new, cutting the mortises by hand with Elroy Bast's chisels, which were the finest tools she had ever held, and which rewarded careful use in a way that made the work feel collaborative rather than solitary. She squared the window opening. She tarred the roof and weighted it with poles until it set. At the end of 3 weeks, she had a small, solid cabin that smelled of fresh pine and new tar paper and the faint ghost of old smoke from the chimney. The floor was level. The door hung straight and latched clean. The stove drew without complaint. She sat at the small workbench she had built against the east wall and laid Elroy Bast's 6 chisels out, in order of width, and sharpened each one in turn. It was the first time in 8 years she had sat at a bench that was entirely her own. On a morning in late October, with frost on the bracken and the birches gone to gold, she followed the corduroy road east. It ran from the back corner of her property, where an old skid path met the tree line. She had found it on her first day and traced it with her eye without following it. Now she did. The first quarter-mile was easy going, the old log corduroys still solid underfoot. Then the road dipped into a low section, and the logs went under standing water. Not the bottomless Muskeg kind, she saw at once, but a seasonal wet area that the old timbers bridged cleanly. She crossed it in 8 long steps and came out on firm ground where the spruce closed in, and the road continued as clearly as before. 3 miles, the letter had said. She walked them in the gray morning quiet, the creak of frost-stiffened branches overhead, the occasional far crack of something moving in the spruces. A loon called once from some hidden water to the north, a going-away sound, late in the season for it, and then the old road curved around a granite outcrop and she stopped. Beyond the rock, in a hollow the surrounding spruce had hidden from any approaching eye, a creek ran wide and shallow over a gravel bar. Along the far bank, set back into the trees, cabins, smoke from 4 chimneys, a woodpile the size of a small barn, fenced kitchen gardens, their stakes bare now for winter. The regular sound of an axe, unhurried and sure. This was Slate Creek. A man working at a chopping block near the nearest cabin straightened and watched her cross the stepping stones without moving toward her. By the time she reached the far bank, 2 others had emerged from doorways. Their expressions were not unfriendly, they were careful. A woman came forward from among them. She was perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair braided over one shoulder, and the posture of someone who had made difficult decisions in hard circumstances and was prepared to make more. She looked at Dinah Frew with the assessing calm of a person who has seen outsiders before and learned not to rush. "You've come a long way on a cold morning," she said. "What brought you down this road?" Dinah looked at her steadily. "My name is Dinah Frew," she said. "I've taken over the old Maddock property down the Birchfall Road. I was cleaning out the hearthstone and found a letter." She paused. "It was written by a man named Elroy Bast. He said that if I ever needed anything, I should come here and say his name." The woman went very still. From somewhere behind her, an older man spoke quietly. Something Dinah didn't catch, and the woman nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had been carrying for a long time. "My name is Violet Drain," the woman said. "Elroy built this cabin." She gestured to the one behind her. "He was here with us before he started his own place. We wondered, after all these years, what had become of his things." The name unlocked something. She could feel it in the air, a collective exhale, the quality of a room relaxing when a door is opened from the inside. Violet Drain brought her in and gave her tea and a seat by the stove, and Dinah told her story plainly. Her father, the 8 years at Warren Colp's mill, the envelope with $94, Mr. Purvis and his smirk, the hearthstone and the chamois roll of chisels, and the letter with its directions, and its advice about clay mortar and creek stone. The people of Slate Creek listened without interrupting. They were the descendants of seven families who had worked the North Timber Limit 40 years ago, until the Harrow Timber Company had arrived with its political connections and its creative interpretation of property boundaries. Rather than spend what little they had in courts they couldn't afford, these families had retreated into the bush, to a valley their grandparents had known, and built a life that appeared on no county register. They kept themselves out of the ledgers deliberately. They had learned, at some cost, what ledgers did to people who couldn't afford lawyers. They did not offer help easily, but they offered it. A man named Reg Towse, who was the settlement's carpenter, looked at the calluses on her hands and asked her, without preamble, where she had learned her joinery. "My father was a furniture maker in Ferris Landing," she said. "I watched him until he died. After that I had 8 years of rough work and a mill hand who knew what real work looked like." Reg Towse studied her hands a moment longer. "Elroy was a fine joiner," he said. "We haven't had anyone with that kind of close work since he left." He paused. "I do boxes and frames and city stuff, but the fitted things, the drawers, the tight work, I haven't got the patience for it." She met his eyes. "I do," she said. Over the winter, she made her first chair for Slate Creek. A simple ladderback with a woven rush seat, for Violet Drain's mother, who sat each day by the fire on a stool that had been troubling her back for years. She made it from birch she had standing on her own property, cut in December when the sap was down, and she fitted every joint with Elroy Bast's chisels. The rungs were shaped on a shave horse she built herself from scrap timber, following Calvin Sparr's instructions from memory. When she carried the chair across on a cold January morning and set it beside the old woman's fire, she said nothing about what had gone into it. The old woman settled into it, shifted her weight, and was quiet for a moment. "That," she said finally, "is the first chair I have ever sat in that fit me." In the spring, Dinah began bringing supplies from Harrow Falls. What she could carry in a pack and what Conrad Vale would haul to the end of the Birchfall Road when the ground firmed. Salt, flour, steel bar for the settlement's smithing work, lamp wicks, thread. In return, Slate Creek gave her things that couldn't be purchased. Which stretch of creekbank clay, set hard through frost and which crumbled, how to read the ice on the low corduroy section before it became impassable, how to dry and store the chanterelles that fruited in August in the deep spruce shade. She learned their names slowly, the way you learn a new wood, by working alongside it and paying careful attention. By the following autumn, she had 3 orders for furniture from homesteads along the north roads. Word had moved the way word moves in country, where people talk to each other across long distances. A settle bench for a family in Greer Crossing. A set of kitchen shelves for a logging camp foreman's wife. A blanket chest for a young couple in Slate Creek itself, cut from a length of white ash that Reg Towse had been saving for something worth making. She filled each order at her bench in the Maddock cabin, working in the mornings when the light came level and clean through the east window and the stove had taken the chill out of the air. The marking gauge sat on the shelf above the bench. between the lamp and a piece of quartz she had found in the creek bed. Below it, Elroy Bast's 6 chisels hung in a row on the wall, each fitted into a holder she had turned and shaped herself. She thought sometimes of Warren Colp, of his measured voice, his ledger mind, the way he had looked at the window rather than at her face when he handed her the envelope. She did not feel bitterness toward him, exactly. It was something quieter and more final. A simple understanding that a man who measured the world only in columns would never have looked at the Maddock claim and seen anything worth having. He had never been taught, as she had been taught, to look closely, to understand that value lives in the thing itself, not in what the books say about it. Her father had taught her that, though not in so many words. He taught it with his hands, with the patient way he fitted a joint and tested it with his thumbs before ever reaching for the glue. Elroy Bast had taught it by hiding everything he had under a hearthstone and writing a letter with practical advice about clay and creekbed stone, addressed to no one and to whoever needed it most. The corduroy road that everyone in Harrow Falls said ended in Muskeg had not ended. It had only required someone willing to cross the wet section and keep going. We will leave Dinah Frew here, on a November evening, at the bench her father would have recognized. The light low, the stove ticking as it cooled, the marking gauge on the shelf above her, and the chisels quiet on the wall. She was 23 years old. She had a property that was hers alone, a craft that was growing stronger in her hands with each order, and a community of people who had begun to say her name when something needed to be built. She had left Cotter's Ridge with $94 and a marking gauge. She had spent nearly all of it on a piece of land that a smirking land agent in a faded paint office had considered utterly worthless. It was the best money she ever spent. We hope this story found you well tonight, wherever you are watching from across this country. If it did, share it with someone who might need it. Someone standing at the beginning of a road that looks like it ends in nothing, trying to decide whether to keep going. And before you go, we will leave you with this. What road have you known in your own life that everyone told you was a dead end? And what did you find when you followed it past the place where they said it stopped?